You're listening to Community Forum on KCCC 930 AM, sponsored by Eddy County, honoring God, country, and family, thriving with industry since 1889.
Thank you for listening to Community Forum. My name's Johnny Chandler. I'm the owner of KCCC 930 AM and the host of Community Forum. And with me today this month, yet again, is Paul Gessing. Paul Gessing is the president of the Rio Grande Foundation. Paul, welcome, and go ahead and give us a line or two about your organization and what you all do.
Yeah, Rio Grande Foundation is a nonpartisan policy research think tank based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We deal with New Mexico policy issues, anything impacting New Mexico economically, educationally, constitutionally, we concern ourselves with. So predominantly that's the legislature, but of course, we're in an election season, and anybody on the ballot, anything on the ballot can impact those issues and those rights right here in the land of enchantment.
Well, glad you're here again. We're going to let you lead the conversation after I get over this part. Just want to update. You wrote an editorial in the local newspaper here, the Carlsbad Current-Argus, shortly before the Carlsbad City Council voted to pass a plastic bag ban trial. So just to update everybody real quick, on February 1st, 2025, there will be a plastic bag ban in the city limits of Carlsbad. That is going to be a 2-year trial. The city council will assess it again within 2 years, and we'll still be here in 2 years, and we'll let you know what happens. And they'll update them throughout if the community has frustrations or not. But I know that you had a little bit of comment on that editorial. It was widely read and widely talked about in the community, that's for sure.
Thank you. I'm glad it's not a permanent bag ban. I hope that they study the trash that is generated before and after the bag ban takes effect, because one of my main points in that article was that places like New Jersey and California, where they've had plastic bag bans in effect for years, and California for a decade, they've actually seen increases in plastic waste because specifically getting rid of those thin plastic bags that we're kind of familiar with tends to result in what are called reusable heavier plastic bags. Well, those reusable plastic bags may not be as reusable as the advocates believe they should be, and they actually multiply and increase the plastic waste that hits the city or county dump, and that's not what the advocates are looking for. So in California, they actually went back and completely banned all plastic bags of all types from their stores. So we'll see how that one works out. Thankfully, Carlsbad didn't go that far.
All right. We'll definitely see. We'll pay attention. So let's move on quickly. I know you've got some other things you want to talk about, but let's talk about the election real quick. We don't shy away that we pre-record. Literally the day that we're recording yesterday, Nella Domenici and Senator Heinrich had their first debate on KOAT. I assume you watched that?
I did not watch the entire thing. We had an event called Liberty on the Rocks that evening. I did see some of the back and forth, the highlights, whatnot.
Right.
That is, I want to talk a little bit about just the election and what's at stake. Obviously, the presidential race is top of the ticket. Then we'll get to the Senate race, and there is a possibility that I think New Mexico could be back in play. We were looking like we were in play in the presidential race when Joe Biden was still on the ticket. Then Kamala Harris came in. There was a ton of excitement, a lot of money flowing into her coffers, a lot of goodwill, and the media very much behind her. That seems to be disintegrating. The question is, will that disintegrate enough by Election Day for President Trump to win New Mexico? It's been since 2004 since any Republican, and George W. Bush narrowly won New Mexico back in 2004. It would be an upset for sure for Trump to win New Mexico, but we're not outside the boundaries of the margin of error in some of these polls. So
why is that though? Why is he all of a sudden, like, we were purple for a long time, then I felt like the last couple of election cycles we've been pretty solid blue. So how is it as a state that now Trump can kind of start to move in? What are you attributing that to?
We got an hour left in the show, right? We got
much less than that. We do about 30 minutes. Sorry. Give me the cliff notes.
let's just say that the reasons for New Mexico's drifting to the political left or towards blue state status, those are complicated. I do think that top of the list was the retirement of Senator Pete Domenici, who, of course, we'll talk about Nella and that situation in a minute. But Pete Domenici, through his longtime occupation of the Senate seat there, kind of became the gravitational force that kept the Republican Party together. Definitely brought some pork back to New Mexico through his powerful position on the Energy Committee. And when he retired, it kind of threw the Republican apparatus in this state into disarray. I would say that there are a lot of other things to talk about, but certainly the retirement of Pete Domenici and his being the organizing principle for Republican politics and also being such a powerful figure, providing needed resources at the national labs, military bases. And I think he was just able to keep the Republican Party relevant in New Mexico, in a state that, demographically, socially has always, been more to the political left, including at the legislative level, which we've been Democrat legislatively for most of the last 90 plus years. So
Right.
I think it was really the force of one man, Senator Domenici, that kept us kind of in that more middle ground.
So what does that mean? I guess let's talk about this real quick. So if you believe that there's a slight chance, according to the polling, that Trump may be in play to win New Mexico, then does that cascade down the ballot? Does that mean that Nella Domenici has a greater shot, or is there maybe a larger threat to Senator Heinrich than Senator Heinrich has faced since he ran for Senate?
So President Trump is in many ways similar to Pete Domenici at the national level, where he has become this organizing force for Republican politics. And, 4 years down the road, one way or the other, Republicans are going to have a lot of discussions about serious policy issues. But for the time being, President Trump is, I think, running in a good position against Kamala Harris. Whether he can drag Nella Domenici over the finish line in New Mexico, that's a little bit more of a question mark. But I do think it is a competitive race between Nella and Heinrich. Heinrich being an incumbent, he's been there for quite a while in Washington. He's in a position where he wouldn't necessarily, I think, want to or have to debate Nella Domenici if he didn't find her to be a threat. So he, just by engaging with her, has shown that she's a force in New Mexico politics. And we'll see if she has a future outside of the Senate race. I mean, obviously, if she wins, that would be an incredible victory, not just for her, but for Republicans. And it would put Republicans in the Congress on a very strong footing. And then, it'll be up to Trump and the Republicans to govern and do so in a coherent and competent way. And it'll be an interesting 4 years. I very much do believe that Trump will win. Nella is much more of a question mark. Yvette Harrell, I do think if Trump wins, Yvette Harrell has a very good shot of winning that congressional seat. And of course, that's important. Every congressional race in the House is super important because the Republicans have had such a narrow majority, and it's made it very difficult for them to impose any sense of coherent conservative governance. And the thing that I look at and question whether Republicans will change their approach is on the government spending. We can't just continue to have these massive budget deficits, spend money ad infinitum. That needs to change. And I know Trump has put Elon Musk's name out there as somebody who he wants to go through and look for government waste and really hone through the federal budget. That would be a big change for President Trump. So we know that if he does win, he's done well appointing federal judges for the Supreme Court and other positions along those lines. He's been pro-energy, which has pluses and minuses, quite frankly, for Southeast New Mexico. I know philosophically, of course, you want people who are pro energy to be in charge, and that makes a lot of things easier for folks in the oil and gas industry. But on the other hand, uh, that could impact pricing if you have more of a bit of a flood of oil and gas supplies coming onto the marketplace. It could have a negative impact on the price point that we've seen in recent years for oil and gas. So
Yeah, it's a real double-edged sword down here,
yeah,
Paul, because I've lived here for a few years now. My wife grew up here. Her family lives here. And when gas prices are too low, it kind of starts to affect our local economy because they're not needing to drill as much. They don't need as many guys. Right? Obviously, it affects the bottom line. There's a sweet spot here. My wife and I have figured out it's about $2.50 a gallon. Right? If we get $2.50 a gallon gasoline, everybody's shopping and buying and doing everything. Right? If it gets obviously too much higher, that also constricts. So it's a real sweet spot, and we figure it's about $2.50 right now. We're looking at $2.89 a gallon gasoline here, and that's not affecting much. I think we're just becoming more and more used to the idea that that's where the price lives now. You know, but you're right. It's a real double-edged sword down here. And that, real quick, I have two questions for you. I have one statement and one question. One statement is we have interviewed Nello Domenici on this radio station. I have asked Senator Heinrich for an interview for any amount of time, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. One of his PR people responded via email and saying, yes, we will do that for you. And that has yet to happen. But if he does call and does an interview with us, we will 100% put it on and give the same footing that we gave Nello Domenici as well. But I think that's important for the audience to understand as a community member down here. Nello Domenici, Senate candidate, came down, spoke to us, toured the college that we're teamed up with, and really was in the community. Martin Heinrich came down here recently for a press conference for $1 million that he said he gave to the Carlsbad Police Department for radios, and did not come visit the college and is still yet to do an interview with any local media outlet. So I just want to say that as a statement, and people listening can take with that what they will. And then my other question for you is Gabe Vasquez, Yvette Harrell. We've talked about this before. You mentioned it. It's a good way to get into this. You said, and we believe that Yvette Harrell could have won that race 2 years ago.
absolutely. All that would have had to have happened is for the areas of Leonetti County and for Otero County, which is her home county, to turn out at the statewide average. And Yvette Harrell would have continued to serve as the congresswoman in that part of southern New Mexico.
So that seat's very winnable for Yvette Harrell. That seat is wide open.
It's a 50-50 seat. And, you know, it does seem that the political winds are blowing from a more favorable direction. Of course, we thought that there would be a red wave 2 years ago. That didn't pan out. And obviously, Yvette did not win. And a big culprit was the lack of voter turnout in far southeast New Mexico, and including her home area. And one of the things that I'm glad to see in this election is that Trump and the Republicans in general have not focused on some of these voter fraud issues and questioning the legitimacy of the ballot and the election. Obviously, you want to have appropriate level of oversight. You want to be very cognizant of what's happening in the election, but using rhetoric publicly in front of your supporters and advocates saying, this whole thing's a sham, essentially, is not helpful. And I think it probably had a significant detrimental impact. So those are some of the factors I think that are going to help Yvette Harrell. In my opinion, that I think she'll take the seat back, but we'll see.
Yeah, it's a flip-flopping seat, right? From Pierce to Teague to who is Yvette Harrell, and then the woman that won before her. I can't even remember her name. But yeah, so every 2 years is like almost a new person.
Small.
That's right, Torres Small. Yeah, so every 2 years it's almost somebody new, and this time at least it'll be either the incumbent or somebody that's been in there before. I guess at least is a way to put that statement. All right, elections going on now. You can early vote now. You can vote on November 5th. Just make sure you vote. That's the most important thing. Every single person should vote. I think we know that, but why do we have to continue to say it? We do. Paul, let's just move on. You've got some other stuff that you really wanted to bring up to me, specifically related to a tweet back in September, and so I'm really interested in what you have to share about that.
Yeah, it's not just any tweet from any person. It's from the Speaker of New Mexico's House of Representatives, and he said the quote is that today at the Legislative Finance Committee, experts forecasted that permanent fund investments in New Mexico will surpass oil and gas as our leading revenue source by 2039. What he's essentially saying is that New Mexico will be more reliant on investments made on oil and gas money that the state has in its various funds than it will be on actual revenues from the industry in any given year, or more fundamentally, I believe, the taxpayers of the state of New Mexico, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And I think it has some pretty profound impacts in a lot of directions. First and foremost, economically speaking, I am foursquare against the government being able to sit on piles of cash, billions of dollars, 54.7 at last count, $54.7 billion that has been collected and set aside from the oil and gas industry, to the point where it can rely on revenues generated, investments generated by those dollars, more than even the annual oil and gas revenues. That just has a profound impact on the accountability of government, but it indicates that our state is sitting on way too much money that could easily be used by the citizens, by businesses, to diversify our economy and not just have all the money sitting in government coffers. So that's the critical thing. But we talk a lot about democracy. We've heard a lot about threats to democracy. Well, in my opinion, one of the fundamental tenets of democracy is, and I use that in the Democratic Republican sense as well, is that we have this governing class that relies on the efforts of its citizens to generate revenue, not just for themselves and their families, but for the government and its ongoing operations. The further government gets away from relying on its citizens for its own benefits, its own revenues, the less accountable that government is to the people. And we've already in New Mexico had a long track record of government corruption and government using its money in ways that don't help the people of the state. So now we're on a fast track, if you will. 15 years seems like a long time, but it's not a real long time for these kinds of fundamental changes. And I would say that this is yet another government-centric view of our political classes in Santa Fe, who think that this is a great thing, that we should be able to get by without relying even on the work and the taxes paid by average citizens and businesses in the state of New Mexico. It's concerning.
I think it's an interesting point. I certainly was not paying attention to that. And I think you explained it well enough to myself and to everybody listening as to why that's concerning, because basically what you're saying is they're still going to take our tax dollars, but the most of the money they're spending is not going to come from our tax dollars. It's going to come from oil and gas revenue and all of our hard work still nonetheless, right? And then so that way it makes our pile of money and our influence much, much less. They're beholden to the bankers and not the citizens of the state. Am I looking at that way too simply?
No, that's pretty good. But I would also just fundamentally be concerned that the state of New Mexico has so much money that it's sitting on that the simple investment of that money is where they're going to be getting a majority of the revenue that they use for government activities. And that's just an indicator. If we were a state that was at the top of all the good lists and the bottom of all the bad ones, if we were knocking it out of the park in education, if we were diversifying our economy and growing, if we were Norway, for example, a nation that very heavily does rely on its oil and gas wealth, Norway with some very, very high social indicators. New Mexico was not Norway. We are the polar opposite of Norway, at least relative to a first world country. We should be using those dollars to diversify our economy and grow in ways that might use a portion of some of those resources. But it's just not healthy for government to have that sheer amount of money in its coffers.
It's the largest in the country, is it not?
Uh, Believe it or not, Alaska's is bigger, and Alaska uses theirs totally differently. Texas, I think, also, of course, much bigger state. You could argue based on the population of Texas that theirs is actually smaller on a per
Yeah.
capita basis, but Alaska's is the one that people really have the most knowledge of, simply because they return so much of their money to the citizens of Alaska. They have that permanent fund dividend, which I think we've talked about it in the past. I'm not opposed to that kind of thing, but uh, Alaska is a state that already has no sales tax and no personal income tax. They clearly have prioritized those in advance of pouring this money into other purposes. So New Mexico's got a long way to go before we, I think, successfully prioritize how we use this oil and gas largesse that we've been blessed with.
Everything you just said, Alaska does when it comes to taxes, income tax, sales tax, the dividend that comes back. Everybody knows about the $1,000 or $1,500 everybody gets every year. We are wealthy enough to do those type of things in this state.
We are in far better shape, and our oil and gas industry is in far better shape than Alaska. First and foremost, you just got to acknowledge Alaska is in one of the least favorable positions geographically. If you don't like cold weather, forget it. It's isolated geographically. You pretty much have to get on an airplane to go anywhere else, realistically, in the lower 48. And actually, their oil and gas industry is shrinking because some of their fields have been in service for so long, and they're trying to access new supplies up in the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. Now, just realistically, that's something that this presidential race will be very critical for, because Trump was in the process of getting access to those fields in northern Alaska, whereas the Biden administration overturned that decision. And that might be something that Trump does to increase the energy supplies available to the United States. And that would help Alaska for sure. It might depress prices, though, for us here in New Mexico.
Right. So I'm going to tell you a short story, and it's going to be a perfect segue into the next topic. The other day, my wife and I, we own a vineyard and a pumpkin patch here in Eddy County as well. The other day, I drove to Seminole, Texas to buy a brand new John Deere tractor. Right. A couple of notes to that. The John Deere tractor in Seminole, Texas was $4,000 less than the John Deere tractor here in Eddy County. And the other noteworthy thing is that the minute I crossed the state line into Seminole, Texas, I no longer was driving on bumpy and pothole-ridden roads. Those are my 2 points related to that story. We now that we live here in Carlsbad, I lived in Albuquerque for 20 years. Right. Now that we live in Carlsbad, we go to Texas for our big purchases. It's cheaper. It's less expensive. And so, one, it's less expensive in Texas to purchase things. And then two, the minute you cross the state line, you can tell the difference. I don't even need a welcome to Texas sign. I can tell by the roads. So I think you mentioned something before we started recording that we are sitting on a ton of capital outlay money, which is money that's designed to be spent for infrastructure. Right. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, let me just say that that's fascinating that you're paying a lower price in Texas, because, of course, Texas is known for its zero income tax state. It's not known for a particularly low sales tax rate.
Right.
Obviously, they don't have our onerous and harmful gross receipts tax, but the fact that something is still cheaper over in Texas highlights something about the cost of doing business, broadly speaking, is just lower in the state of Texas. So that's obviously a lot of different policies that are impacting that. But you mentioned the roads, and yes, I wanted to talk about that. And if you can't tell, we're pretty hell bent here at the Rio Grande Foundation on pointing out that the state of New Mexico is sitting on a lot of money that's really not doing a heck of a lot to improve the lives of New Mexicans. And the Legislative Finance Committee noted that there's $6 billion. This is in addition to the 54.7 I just talked about. $6 billion in capital outlay unspent. Now, we've discussed to an extent the issues with our capital outlay process. We're heading into the holiday season here. They call it the Christmas tree bill. They call it that because the legislators just put their projects out there and they get funded, whether they're a priority for the state, whether they really are not needed or not. And shockingly, or perhaps not shockingly, given what you just said, I was doing some research to find which state has the worst roads in America. And a report came right up from some trial attorneys. John Foy Associates found, they did a report and they found that New Mexico actually is the state with the very worst roads in America. Louisiana, Mississippi, California, Arizona, Colorado, other states that have bad roads. So the Southwest is not very good to its roads, but they looked at rural roads, urban roads. They looked at deaths on the roads, and New Mexico scored poorly in all of those categories. And it's a major concern. It's also something that should drive changes with our capital outlay structure, where I think it would be great to sunset, for example, if you've got money sitting in the capital outlay bills that's not being used, that you sunset that money and have it go to the road fund and build and repair roads that are necessary. And then in general, just let's cut through the red tape. Let's make sure that building and maintaining decent roads is a priority. And I know 285 has been a problem for years, and repairing that and getting that into good shape. But a lot of the roads in southeast New Mexico have been disproportionately torn up as a result of the trucks that have brought that prosperity to the state, with the oil and gas industry. And some focus on that would be not only helpful, but it would be, I think, a lifesaver for some number of people who, unfortunately, through the poor quality of our roads, suffer very significant consequences. So there's no reason for that money to be sitting unspent in accounts doing nothing, especially when there's talk of raising the gas tax in Santa Fe as soon as this legislative session.
Right. We should just raise taxes in the state all the time. Why not? We just talked about how little money we're sitting on. Okay. Sarcasm. Obviously, I know you got that, but it's basically a little frustrating. I thought I saw you on KOAT not too long ago in Albuquerque talking about the general obligation bonds. Did you get an interview with them a while back on it?
I did. Yeah. Pretty simple. Went through the ballot and looked at what is on the ballot this November in terms of some of the statewide issues and whether there are constitutional amendments or, as you mentioned, bonds. And it's worth noting, of course, that bonds are debt that we take on and agree to pay back as citizens for various priorities. And one of those priorities, unfortunately, roads are not the big one. There's nothing related to roads on this ballot on a statewide basis, but it's the biggest one is higher education, and that's a $230 million bond that will be on the ballot. That's question 3. There's 4 bonds: $30.1 million for senior facilities, $19 million for libraries, $230 million for higher education, and $10 million for public safety communications systems. So the one I think is most noteworthy, most concerning is the higher ed bond number 3, due to the proliferation of higher ed campuses and the free college, which we're already pouring money into across the state. Then we have 4 constitutional measures on the ballot. 2 of those, 1 and 2, deal with veterans and increasing their exemptions for, in the first case, if you're 100% disabled in New Mexico, you get a property tax exemption of 100%. The idea would be to make that 50% if you're 50% disabled, 25% for 25% disabled, and so on. So essentially giving people who are not 100% disabled veterans a chance to take some part of the exemption on their property taxes. The other one Constitutional Amendment 2 increases the exemption for veterans from $4,000 to $10,000 and indexes it to inflation so that that grows in the future as we see inflation increase. Amendment 3 gives the UNM Law School dean the ability to designate somebody to chair the Judicial Nominating Commission rather than themselves. They could nominate an associate dean, faculty member, retired faculty member, or former dean at the University of New Mexico. Number 4, I think, is the most interesting and impactful. That one changes the system of designating salaries for county commissioners from the legislature having a 3-class system, A, B, and C, with the bigger counties more populated having higher salaries set by the legislature, to allowing county commissions themselves to set the salaries for county commissioners. And I think that is something that's going to give some voters heartburn and probably should be carefully thought about and vetted, because you're giving county officers, elected officials, the ability to set their own salaries, essentially. And, I think that could be problematic for a lot of folks.
Would they be able to set their own? They could set their own salaries, but it would have to be done through the official process, right? During a meeting with public comment.
Yeah.
Okay, but
and of course, they would be voted on in the future. So if somebody gets way out of line, theoretically, the voters could call them into account in the next election. But you are changing a process, and that process could obviously open itself to just shenanigans, as they say.
Well, throughout the time that I've been in New Mexico as an adult enough to pay attention, New Mexicans do not like paying their elected officials. They get real heartburn over that.
That is true.
Yeah. And I don't know. I'm not saying I disagree with it, but I was saying the mayor of the city of Carlsbad does not get paid. Wow. And so we have a mayor that has a full-time job as a firefighter at the waste isolation pilot plant and is the full-time mayor as well. And they don't even give him a median salary of all the city officials or something. So I think that that's one of those ones that you could definitely argue either way on whether public officials do need a fair full-time salary or not. You know what I mean? I feel like that's one that people can go around on.
Absolutely. There's ample room for debate and discussion on everybody from the Carlsbad mayor to county commissioners to, of course, the legislature, where we've seen that debate taking place for several years now.
Yeah. I have a theory when it comes to state legislatures and getting paid, though, is I don't want a state legislature full-time. I don't want them really passing any laws, right? It's enough that they do it once a year for 30 days, and then every other year is 60 days. It's just new laws. It's just an opportunity for new legislation and new restrictions and new bureaucracy. And so personally, I just would rather that we did not have a full-time legislature, because then they would just spend all day, every day, trying to figure out new laws for us to follow.
Right. And saying that every other state has a paid legislature is a little bit misleading. For example, New Hampshire, which has, I believe, over 400 members of their House, they get a one-time payment per session of $100. So that's actually a lot less generous than New Mexico with its per diem. And New Hampshire's, I would argue, one of the most free and successful states in the entire country. So without oil and gas at all, they have no income tax and no sales tax. So New Hampshire, the free state, doing a lot of things right. So it's it's certainly worth debating and discussing. I have many opinions I think we probably share in terms of paying public officials.
Agreed. So we're almost out of time, Paul, but I want to give you the last word. We'll have you on again next month after the election, which will be wonderful to hear from you on. But let's go ahead and start closing us out with whatever you'd like to close us out with.
Yeah, well, obviously, this election is very critical. Every election is important, but this one, we see two very contrasting viewpoints from America's two major parties, starting from the very top. And we've lived in New Mexico under progressive Democrat rule. The legislature, all 112 of those folks are up. They share a relative consistent philosophy of bringing more limited governments and more free markets and diversification. I don't think we're going to see fundamental change in the sense that we're going to see a party flip a house or anything in New Mexico this election cycle. But is New Mexico destined to be California style blue state where you just have a D behind your name and you win? Or are we going to reassert ourselves as being a little more competitive, starting at the legislature, obviously the presidential race and the U.S. Senate? All of those are very critical to the future of the state of New Mexico.
All right. Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation. Where can we find you?
RioGrandeFoundation.org, errorsoфenchantment.com.
All right. Once again, Paul Gessing, Rio Grande Foundation president. Thank you very much for coming on, sir.
Thanks, Johnny. Talk to you soon.
You're listening to Community Forum on KCCC 930 AM, sponsored by Eddy County, honoring God, country, and family, thriving with industry since 1889.